Genesis 2 describes the creation of the first woman, formed from the man's side while he slept, brought to him as the answer to the statement that it was not good for the man to be alone. Genesis 2:23 records his response. "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Genesis 3 then records the event that defines her role in the rest of Scripture. A serpent approaches Eve directly, not the man, and questions God's instruction about the fruit of one specific tree. Eve responds by restating the command, though she adds a detail not present in the original instruction God gave to Adam, that they must not even touch the fruit. The serpent contradicts God outright, and Eve, seeing that the fruit was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, takes it and eats it, then gives some to her husband who was with her. The consequences that follow are recorded in detail, for the serpent, for the ground, and specifically for Eve, whose judgment in Genesis 3:16 includes pain in childbearing and a changed relationship with her husband. But Genesis 3:20 records something easy to miss in the weight of the judgment. Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living, a name given after the fall, not before it, functioning as a statement of ongoing purpose despite the consequence. Eve is referenced again in 1 Timothy 2:13-14 and 2 Corinthians 11:3, both passages that engage directly with the Genesis account in shaping New Testament teaching, making her the only woman in the Bible whose actions are explicitly discussed and interpreted across both Testaments. Sarah appears throughout Genesis as Abraham's wife, and her story is defined by a promise that takes decades to fulfill. Genesis 12 records that she was already involved in Abraham's household when God first called him to leave his homeland with the promise of descendants as numerous as the stars. Twice in Genesis, in Egypt and later in Gerar, Abraham introduces Sarah as his sister rather than his wife out of fear for his own safety, a half-truth the text does not hide or excuse. Sarah was, in fact, Abraham's half-sister through their father. When years pass without a child, Sarah gives her servant Hagar to Abraham as a surrogate, a solution the text presents as Sarah's own initiative in Genesis 16:2, though it leads to lasting tension between the two women. The most well-known moment in Sarah's account comes in Genesis 18, when 3 visitors tell Abraham that Sarah, by then well past childbearing age, will have a son within the year. Genesis 18:12 records Sarah laughing to herself at the tent entrance, and when confronted about the laughter, denying it out of fear, an exchange God addresses directly. The son Isaac is born as promised, and his name itself, meaning he laughs, permanently commemorates the moment. Sarah's death and burial in the cave of Machpelah, recorded in Genesis 23, is given unusually specific attention for a Genesis burial account, including the exact price Abraham paid for the burial site, 400 shekels of silver. Rebekah. Genesis 24 records one of the most detailed courtship narratives in the Bible, and it is built entirely around a test Rebekah passes without knowing she is being tested. Abraham's servant, sent to find a wife for Isaac, prays for a specific sign, that the woman who offers water not only to him, but also to his 10 camels, would be the one God had chosen. Rebekah appears at the well and does exactly this, without prompting, and the text notes in Genesis 24:20 that she kept running back and forth to the well until all the camels had had enough. Presented as a spontaneous act of hospitality rather than a performance for an audience. Rebekah's family gives her the choice of whether to leave immediately with the servant or wait, and Genesis 24:58 records her answer in a single word: I will go. Later, in Genesis 27, Rebekah becomes the architect of one of the most consequential deceptions in the Old Testament. Knowing that her husband Isaac intends to give his blessing to his older son Esau, Rebekah orchestrates a plan for her younger son Jacob to impersonate his brother and receive the blessing instead. A blessing that, once given, cannot be revoked, and that permanently redirects the covenant line through Jacob rather than Esau. Miriam. Miriam is introduced without being named in Exodus 2, as the sister who watches over the basket carrying her infant brother Moses on the Nile, and who approaches Pharaoh's daughter with an offer to find a Hebrew nurse for the child, arranging, in effect, for Moses' own mother to raise him within Pharaoh's household. She reappears by name after the crossing of the Red Sea. Exodus 15:20 identifies her directly as Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, and records her leading the women of Israel in song and dance with tambourines, celebrating the defeat of Pharaoh's army, one of the earliest instances of a woman explicitly called a prophet in the Bible. Miriam's account takes a difficult turn in Numbers 12, where she and Aaron challenge Moses' authority, questioning specifically whether the Lord speaks only through Moses. God's response is direct and severe. Miriam, though not Aaron, is struck with a skin disease and is required to remain outside the camp for 7 days before being allowed to return. The text notes in Numbers 12:15 that the entire community did not move on until she was brought back in. Miriam dies in Numbers 21, in the wilderness of Zin, and her death is recorded with the same brief formality given to the deaths of major figures like her brothers. Rahab. Joshua 2 records that when Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho ahead of the Israelite invasion, they lodge in the house of a woman identified plainly as a prostitute, named Rahab. When the king of Jericho sends men to find them, Rahab hides the spies on her roof under stalks of flax and misdirects the search, then negotiates directly with the spies for the safety of her family in exchange. Joshua 2:11 records Rahab's own explanation for her decision, spoken to the spies before she helps them. "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." She had heard what happened at the Red Sea and to neighboring kings, and had already concluded, ahead of the invasion, which side represented the true God. The spies instruct her to tie a scarlet cord in her window as a marker, and when Jericho falls in Joshua 6, the text records specifically that Rahab and her entire family were spared, and that she lived among the Israelites from that time on. Rahab's account continues beyond Joshua. Matthew 1:5 places her directly in the genealogy of Jesus, listed as the mother of Boaz, meaning the woman introduced as a Canaanite prostitute becomes, within a few generations, a direct ancestor of King David and of Christ. Hebrews 11:31 and James 2:25 both cite her by name as an example of faith demonstrated through action, making her one of only 2 women named individually in the entire faith chapter of Hebrews 11. Deborah. Judges 4 introduces Deborah with a concentration of titles unusual for any figure in the book of Judges, male or female. Judges 4:4 identifies her as a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, and states that she was leading Israel at that time. And Judges 4:5 adds that the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided, holding court under a palm tree that came to be known by her name. When God's instruction comes for Israel to move against the Canaanite commander Sisera, Deborah summons a military leader named Barak and relays the command directly. Barak's response, recorded in Judges 4:8, is a condition. He will go only if Deborah goes with him. Deborah agrees, but tells him plainly that the path he has chosen will mean the honor of the coming victory goes not to him, but to a woman. Deborah goes into battle alongside Barak, and Judges 4:14 records her giving the command to advance at the decisive moment. Sisera's army is routed, and Sisera himself flees on foot, directly into the events of the next account. Judges 5 preserves what is known as the Song of Deborah, a victory poem sung by Deborah and Barak together, considered by many scholars to be among the oldest pieces of literature preserved in the Hebrew Bible, predating the surrounding prose account by potentially centuries in its original composition. Jael. Judges 4 continues directly from Deborah's prophecy. Sisera, fleeing the defeat of his army on foot, arrives at the tent of a woman named Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, a family with a peace treaty in place with Sisera's king, giving him reason to expect safety there. Jael greets him with hospitality that matches the expectation. Judges 4:18 records her inviting him in, telling him not to be afraid, and covering him with a blanket when he asks her to stand at the entrance and turn away anyone who comes looking for him. He asks for water. She gives him milk instead and covers him again. Once Sisera falls asleep from exhaustion, Judges 4:21 records what happens next in unflinching detail. Jael took a tent peg and a hammer, went quietly to him, and drove the peg through his temple into the ground while he was sound asleep. He died. When Barak arrives in pursuit moments later, Jael comes out to meet him and shows him what she has done. Judges 5:24 gives Jael a formal designation in the victory song that follows. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women. The killing of an enemy commander by a woman using a tent peg is treated in the text not as a scandal to be softened, but as the fulfillment of Deborah's earlier prophecy that the honor of Sisera's defeat would belong to a woman rather than to Barak. Ruth and Naomi. The book of Ruth opens with Naomi, an Israelite woman who has lost her husband and both her sons while living in the foreign land of Moab, left with 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem and tells both women to go back to their own families and start new lives. One does. Ruth 1:16-17 records the other's answer, in words that have become among the most quoted in the entire Bible. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Ruth, a Moabite, a nationality with a complicated and often hostile history in Israelite scripture, returns with Naomi to Bethlehem with nothing, and immediately goes out to glean leftover grain in the fields, the ancient provision for the poor and foreign residents. Ruth 2:3 notes, almost in passing, that as it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz notices her, is told of her loyalty to Naomi, and extends specific protection and extra provision to her. Following Naomi's guidance, Ruth eventually approaches Boaz directly at the threshing floor and asks him, using the language of the era, to act as a kinsman redeemer, a relative with the right and responsibility to marry a widow and preserve her deceased husband's family line. Boaz agrees, resolves a legal complication involving a closer relative, and marries her. Ruth 4:17 records the birth of their son Obed and closes the book with a genealogy. Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. A foreign widow who arrived in Bethlehem with nothing becomes within one generation the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king, and appears again, alongside Rahab, in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1:5. Hannah. 1 Samuel opens with a woman named Hannah, one of 2 wives of a man named Elkanah, described in 1 Samuel 1:2 with a detail the text does not soften. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. 1 Samuel 1:6 adds that Peninnah provoked her severely to make her miserable, specifically because of this. During the family's yearly visit to the tabernacle at Shiloh, Hannah prays with an intensity the priest Eli initially misreads. 1 Samuel 1:13 describes her praying silently, only her lips moving, and Eli, assuming she is drunk, confronts her. Hannah corrects him directly, explaining she has been pouring out her soul before the Lord. Her vow, recorded in this same prayer, is specific. If given a son, she will give him back to the Lord for all the days of his life. The son, Samuel, is born, and Hannah keeps her vow with striking literalness. Once the child is weaned, likely around age 3 in the customs of the period. Hannah brings him to Eli at Shiloh and leaves him there permanently to be raised in service to God. 1 Samuel 2:19 records that she visited him once a year afterward, bringing a small robe she had made for him each time. Hannah's prayer of praise in 1 Samuel 2, offered after leaving Samuel at Shiloh, contains language and themes: the reversal of the proud and the humble, the poor being lifted up, that scholars have long noted as a direct structural and thematic precursor to Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1, composed roughly 1,000 years later. Abigail. 1 Samuel 25 introduces Abigail as the wife of a wealthy but difficult man named Nabal, whom the text describes directly in verse 3 as surly and mean in his dealings. When David's men, who had protected Nabal's shepherds and property without incident, request food and provisions during a sheep-shearing feast, Nabal refuses with open contempt, insulting David by name. David, enraged, immediately gathers 400 armed men with the intention of killing every male in Nabal's household by morning. A servant, recognizing the danger, goes to Abigail rather than to Nabal, telling her directly in 1 Samuel 25:17 that disaster is hanging over the entire household and that Nabal is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail acts immediately and without consulting her husband. She gathers a substantial provision of food, rides out to intercept David personally, and delivers what is one of the longest and most strategically composed speeches given by any woman in the Old Testament. Taking responsibility for the offense, appealing to David's future as king rather than his present anger, and asking him not to have the guilt of needless bloodshed on his conscience. David's response in 1 Samuel 25:32-33 credits her directly with preventing him from committing murder. When Abigail returns home and tells Nabal what she has done the next morning, 1 Samuel 25:37 records that his heart failed him and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, he died. David subsequently sends for Abigail and marries her, the text closing her introduction as a woman whose intervention altered the moral trajectory of Israel's future king before he ever took the throne. Bathsheba. 2 Samuel 11 opens with King David remaining in Jerusalem while his army is at war, and seeing from his rooftop a woman bathing, identified in verse 3 as Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's own soldiers currently at the front. David sends for her, and the text records the encounter and her subsequent pregnancy without extended commentary on her consent or agency, a silence that has generated significant discussion among readers of the text across centuries. When David's attempt to cover the pregnancy by recalling Uriah from battle fails, Uriah refuses the comfort of his own home while his fellow soldiers remain in the field. David arranges for Uriah to be placed at the most dangerous point of the battle line and then abandoned, resulting in his death. The prophet Nathan confronts David directly afterward with a parable about a rich man stealing a poor man's only lamb, and David's own outrage at the story becomes the trap that exposes his guilt. The child from this union dies in infancy. A loss, 2 Samuel 12:24, immediately follows with Bathsheba's second pregnancy, resulting in a son named Solomon. Bathsheba reappears with direct political agency decades later in 1 Kings 1, when, prompted by the prophet Nathan, she goes to the aging King David to secure his public confirmation that Solomon, not his older half-brother Adonijah, will inherit the throne, an intervention that directly determines the succession of the kingdom. Matthew 1:6 includes her in the genealogy of Jesus, referring to her not by name but as Uriah's wife, a specific and unusual genealogical phrasing that keeps the circumstances of Solomon's origin explicitly present in the record. The Queen of Sheba. 1 Kings 10 records that the Queen of Sheba having heard of Solomon's fame connected specifically to the name of the Lord, travels to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions, arriving with a very great caravan of camels carrying spices, an enormous quantity of gold, and precious stones. The text records in 1 Kings 10:3 that Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. Having observed his wisdom, his palace, the organization of his officials, and his offerings at the temple, the queen's own reaction is recorded directly in verse 5. There was no more spirit in her, an idiom conveying that she was left breathless with astonishment. The queen's own words, recorded in 1 Kings 10:6-9, are notable for what they conclude: that the report she had heard in her own country did not tell even half of it, and that Solomon's wisdom and prosperity exceeded what she had been told. She credits the Lord directly for placing Solomon on the throne. The two exchange substantial gifts before her return home, and the text notes the specific quantity of gold she brought: 120 talents, an amount that places her among the wealthiest individual figures recorded transacting with Israel in the entire Old Testament. Jesus references the Queen of Sheba directly in Matthew 12:42, calling her the Queen of the South, and stating that she will rise at the judgment and condemn the generation of his own listeners, because she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And now, something greater than Solomon is here. Esther and Vashti. The book of Esther opens not with its title character, but with Queen Vashti, wife of the Persian king Ahasuerus. Esther 1:11 records the king, at the height of a lavish banquet, commanding Vashti to appear before his guests wearing her royal crown, specifically to display her beauty. Vashti refuses. The text gives no stated reason for her refusal, only the fact of it, and the king's furious reaction, which results in a formal decree removing her position as queen, partly out of fear that her example of defiance might spread to other wives across the empire. This decision creates the vacancy Esther fills. Esther, a Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai, is brought into the king's harem along with many other young women being considered as Vashti's replacement. And Esther 2:10 records that on Mordecai's specific instruction, she does not reveal her Jewish identity. She is chosen as queen. The central crisis of the book arrives when a court official named Haman, enraged that Mordecai will not bow to him, manipulates the king into signing a decree authorizing the extermination of all Jews throughout the empire on a specific date. Mordecai urges Esther to intervene, and delivers what becomes the book's most quoted line in Esther 4:14. "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther's plan requires approaching the king unsummoned, an act that carried the legal risk of execution unless the king extended his scepter. She fasts for 3 days beforehand, then approaches him, and through a carefully staged sequence of 2 banquets, exposes Haman's plot directly to the king. Haman is executed on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai, and though the original decree cannot be technically revoked under Persian law, a second decree is issued permitting the Jews to defend themselves, reversing the outcome entirely. The festival of Purim, still observed today, commemorates this reversal, and the book of Esther is notable within the canon for never once mentioning the name of God directly, while depicting what the text presents as his providence operating entirely through human decisions and timing. Mary, mother of Jesus. Luke 1:26-38 records the angel Gabriel appearing to a young woman in Nazareth named Mary, engaged to a man named Joseph, with an announcement that she will conceive and give birth to a son who will be called the Son of the Most High. Mary's response is not immediate acceptance, but a direct practical question. How will this be, since I am a virgin? And only after Gabriel's explanation does she answer, in Luke 1:38, with the statement that has defined her role in Christian tradition. I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. Luke 1:39-45 records Mary traveling to visit her relative Elizabeth, herself unexpectedly pregnant in old age, and Elizabeth's greeting to her, "Blessed are you among women," is followed immediately by Mary's own extended song of praise, known as the Magnificat, recorded in full across Luke 1:46-55. The song echoes Hannah's prayer from 1 Samuel closely in both structure and theme. Mary appears at several further points across the Gospels, present at the wedding at Cana in John 2, where her request initiates Jesus' first recorded miracle. Standing at the foot of the cross in John 19:25-27, where Jesus, from the cross, formally entrusts her care to the disciple John, and present with the apostles in the upper room in Acts 1:14, in the period between the Ascension and Pentecost, the final direct mention of her in the biblical text. Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is introduced in Luke 8:2 among a group of women who traveled with Jesus and supported his ministry from their own resources, with the specific detail that 7 demons had gone out of her. The text's only stated biographical detail about her prior to this point, and notably not connected anywhere in the Gospels to any account of sexual sin, a popular association that developed later in church history rather than from the biblical text itself. Mary Magdalene is named in all 4 Gospels as present at the crucifixion, and in all 4 Gospels as among the first to arrive at the tomb on the 3rd day. John 20 gives her account the most extended individual treatment. Finding the tomb empty, she runs to tell Peter and John, then returns to the tomb weeping. John 20:14-16 records the moment of recognition. She initially mistakes the risen Jesus for the gardener and only recognizes him when he says her name directly, Mary. Jesus' instruction to her immediately following, recorded in John 20:17, includes the command to go and tell the disciples what she has seen, making Mary Magdalene the first person in any of the 4 gospel accounts to see the risen Jesus, and the first person given a direct commission to announce the resurrection to others, a role early church tradition later described using the Latin title Apostle to the Apostles, though that specific title does not appear in the biblical text itself. Martha and Mary of Bethany. Luke 10:38-42 introduces 2 sisters, Martha and Mary, in an account frequently read alongside their more extended appearance in John 11 and John 12. In Luke's account, Martha is occupied with the considerable preparations of hosting Jesus in her home, while Mary sits at his feet listening to what he says. When Martha asks Jesus to tell Mary to help her, Jesus' response in Luke 10:41-42 gently redirects rather than sides with either sister completely. Martha is worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one, and Mary has chosen what is better. John 11 gives the fullest account of the sisters, in the narrative surrounding the death and raising of their brother Lazarus, previously covered in full in this channel's video on every resurrection in the Bible. Within that account, Martha's theological exchange with Jesus is given particular weight. John 11:27 records her direct confession, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world," a statement of comparable theological clarity to Peter's confession in the Synoptic Gospels. John 12:1-8 records a further account at Bethany shortly before the crucifixion, in which Mary anoints Jesus' feet with an expensive perfume and wipes them with her hair, an act Judas Iscariot criticizes as wasteful and which Jesus defends directly, stating that she has kept it for the day of his burial. The Samaritan woman. John 4 records an extended encounter between Jesus and an unnamed Samaritan woman at a well near the town of Sychar, notable immediately because Jewish teachers of the period typically avoided both public conversation with women and any interaction with Samaritans, whom Jewish culture of the time generally regarded with hostility. The conversation covers considerable theological ground, moving from a simple request for water to Jesus' description of living water that leads to eternal life, and then to a direct and specific statement about her personal life. John 4:17-18 records Jesus telling her plainly that she has had 5 husbands, and that the man she is currently with is not her husband, a detail she confirms as accurate. The woman raises a substantive theological question about the correct location of worship, Samaritan or Jewish, and Jesus' answer in John 4:23-24, that true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, and that this is what the Father seeks, is delivered specifically to her in a private conversation, rather than to any of the religious authorities Jesus more frequently debates in the Gospels. John 4:28-30 records that she leaves her water jar behind and returns to the town, and her testimony directly leads many Samaritans from that town to seek Jesus out themselves. John 4:39 states plainly that many of the Samaritans believed in him because of the woman's testimony, making her one of the first individuals in any of the Gospels whose direct testimony is credited with producing belief in others. Lydia. Acts 16:11-15 records the Apostle Paul's arrival in the city of Philippi, where, finding no synagogue, he and his companions go to a river outside the city on the Sabbath, expecting to find a place of prayer. There they meet a group of women, among whom is a woman named Lydia, identified specifically as a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, a trade associated with considerable wealth, as purple dye was among the most expensive commodities in the ancient Mediterranean world. Acts 16:14 describes her as a worshiper of God and records that the Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. She and her entire household are baptized, and she immediately extends hospitality, insisting that Paul and his companions stay at her house. Acts 16:15 records her specific language, judging her insistence direct enough to note, "If you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house," and she persuaded us. Lydia's household becomes the base of the church in Philippi, and Acts 16:40 records Paul and Silas returning to her house immediately after their release from prison later in the same chapter, meaning Lydia's home functions as the first recorded church gathering place in Europe, making her, by a direct reading of the text, the founding host of the first Christian congregation on the European continent. Priscilla. Priscilla is introduced in Acts 18:2, alongside her husband Aquila, as a Jewish couple who had recently left Italy after the Roman Emperor Claudius ordered all Jews to leave Rome, a historical detail independently corroborated by Roman historians of the period, anchoring the account to a specific and datable event. Paul stays and works with the couple in Corinth, sharing their trade as tent makers, and Priscilla and Aquila later travel with Paul to Ephesus. Acts 18:24-26 records an episode notable for the order in which the couple is named. A skilled and eloquent teacher named Apollos, who understood the way of the Lord accurately but knew only the baptism of John, begins speaking boldly in the synagogue, and Priscilla and Aquila, hearing him, invite him to their home and explain the way of God to him more adequately. In the Greek text, Priscilla's name is listed before her husband's in this and several other passages, an ordering pattern noted by scholars as unusual for the period and often read as an indication of her particular prominence or teaching role within the couple's shared ministry. Paul references the couple directly in his letters as well. Romans 16:3-4 calls them my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their lives for me, and states that not only Paul, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them, a level of commendation Paul extends to very few individuals by name anywhere in his letters.